We have to begin with what is real if we're going to address the issue of racism. We have to tell the truth, and what's most important about the truths that I'm about to tell, more important than the truths themselves, is the overriding truth that all the truths I'm about to tell you regarding racism in this country are truths that Barack Obama could not tell you during the campaign. And that's the most important truth of all. He could not speak, first of all, he couldn't have said any of the stuff I've said in the first 15 so minutes. Except the part where I thank you for being here. The rest of it he couldn't have said. Not because he doesn't know it, not because he necessarily disagrees with it. He probably doesn't agree with all of it, right? But others he might agree with it, and yet he knows he couldn't say it. He couldn't talk about the things I'm about to say regarding the evidence, the actual factual basis for the claim that racism is still with us. Because if he does, you know what's going to happen. During the campaign, he will be accused of playing the race card, right? He will be accused of pandering to special interests, because in case you didn't know, people of color are apparently special interests. Little did I know it, but now I do. Hockey moms are apparently a universal interest. So it's okay to pander to them. NASCAR dads, also universal interest. Values voters. Joe Sixpack, apparently, that's a constituency to which we can pander. It's like a universe, which brings up a whole other side discussion of whether we really want people who just had 6 beers, to vote at all. I generally support universal suffrage, but in the case of binge drinkers, I'm willing to make an exception on the day of the election, at least. But to talk about racism would be to pander to special interests, and so Obama couldn't talk about this. Even in his race speech, he had to be very careful. As brilliant a piece of political literature as it was, if you really read it carefully, and I know many of you have, it's also a very tortured piece when it comes to understanding racism in the country. He's very careful, because he talked about the legacy of racism. That is to say, we've got this horrible history, and look, most presidents and candidates won't even mention that, so good, that's great. That's more than most will give you. He was also very careful to talk about the legacy of that history as if it was only inertia. Right? In other words, this was a really big problem and we're still living with the aftermath of it, but he wasn't really talking about ongoing discrimination in that talk or in any other talk. In fact, the only thing that he actually pointed out as being present-day discriminatory, which I thought was very problematic, was so-called affirmative action discrimination, right? This idea that, people of color have the legacy of this, but now white folks are the ones now supposedly losing jobs, and they're upset about that. And this, of course, does not comport with the facts, as he well knows, but it's political boilerplate that candidates throw out there to try to make this an equivalent injury somehow, in spite of the evidence. So it's a very interesting document to read, but the point here is that Obama couldn't talk about these things. What couldn't he talk about that we must talk about? Well, he couldn't talk about job discrimination, except insofar as he talked about it in the past. He could not talk about the ongoing evidence. He could not mention the study from the University of Chicago and MIT 4 years ago, which found that job applicants with white-sounding names 50% more likely to get called back for an interview than job applicants with so-called black-sounding names, even when all the qualifications, the credentials, the years of experience, the educational background are indistinguishable. Simply having a white-sounding name being thought of as likely white, haven't even walked in the door and proven one's whiteness yet. Merely being perceived as white gives you a leg up in the job market. That is important, for it suggests not only an ongoing barrier to, in this case, people who are thought of as African-American, but also suggests ongoing advantage and privilege and opportunity and a head start for those of us considered white, contrary to the rhetoric about so-called reverse discrimination, which has always been more about rhetoric than about substance, of course. He couldn't talk about that. He couldn't talk about the study from Alfred and Ruth Blumrose, law professors at Rutgers. Ruth has now passed. Alfred's still very much with us. 2 of the longest-running experts on job-based discrimination in the country, who several years back did a comprehensive study of over 10,000 businesses in the United States, probably the most comprehensive analysis and survey of American industry to determine the extent of racism and discrimination and sexist discrimination ever compiled in the nation's history. And what did it find? It found that approximately, even using a conservative definition of what constitutes discrimination, they used a very limited definition so as to sort of lowball the estimate, because they didn't want to be accused of exaggerating. It took a very conservative understanding of what discrimination is. And even using that limited understanding, found that about 1/3 of all employers in the nation actively and regularly discriminate against job applicants of color, affecting approximately 1.2 to 1.3 million job applicants of color each year, which comes to almost 1/3 of all black and brown job seekers in the course of a given year. That is an epidemic level of racial discrimination, not 20 years ago, not 30 years ago, not 50 years ago, not what we are living with as a legacy, but as something that is quite a bit ongoing, and he couldn't talk about it. He couldn't talk about housing discrimination. Interesting, because we talked a lot about housing in this campaign, did we not? It's a major issue. The housing bubble has burst. The financial crisis is very much rooted to some extent in the housing bubble bursting, and so we're talking about housing, but there's almost no conversation about the racial discrimination which continues to plague either people seeking to buy a home or even just to rent an apartment or a house, as if that wasn't an issue, right? Interesting, because 2006, at which point this campaign was in full swing, or beginning to be, 2006, according to a report released by HUD in 2007, at which point the campaign was most certainly in full swing, 2006 was the year, according to that study, that the largest number of housing discrimination complaints, including race-based complaints, ever filed, were filed. Not 96, 86, 76, 2006. And private studies have for years, as well as government surveys, have suggested that there are anywhere between 2 million on the low end and 3.75 million on the high end instances of race-based discrimination in housing against people of color every single year. Apartments and or houses that they would have been able to procure either as renters or as buyers, but for the color of their skin, even after you control for things like credit history, even after you control for things like collateral income, debt load, etc. But he couldn't talk about that. He couldn't talk about the criminal justice system. Couldn't talk about the Justice Department study from just 3 years ago, which found that black and brown men are about 2 to 3 times more likely than white men to have their cars stopped and searched for drugs or other illegal contraband, but white men, when searched, were 4 times more likely to have the stuff in our car.
Hello.
Now that's deep.
It's true.
It's not just that black and brown men more likely to be stopped and searched. We sort of knew that intuitively. What we didn't know, and it was buried in the footnotes and never talked about in the press, was it was the white guys 4 times more likely to actually have the stuff on us on the 1/3 as likely occasion that we were suspected and searched. Which says what? That racial profiling is not only racist, that's redundant, but also pretty stupid law enforcement. Because if you want to, well, now is it? Because maybe not. It's only stupid if you think the war on drugs is about drugs. And if you think the war on drugs is about drugs, you haven't been paying very much attention, like since it started, because it's never been about that. If it were about that, you would go where the drugs are. And where are they? Not according to Tim Wise, because what do I know? But according to the Centers for Disease Control, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the Department of Health and Human Services, through its subunit called the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, will tell you in every single survey they do that approximately anywhere from 70 to 75% of all the illegal drug users in the United States are what the census calls non-Hispanic white folks. That is actually slightly more than the white share of the population, so we are on a per capita basis disproportionately likely to be drug users. Black folks are about 13% of the users, the same as the African American share of the population. Latinos about 11% of the users, that's less than the Latino share of the population. Put black and brown folk together, you're looking at no more than 25% of the users, 90% of the people locked up for a possession offense. White folks, 70 to 75% of the users, less than 10% of the people locked up for a possession offense. This is not about drugs. I know it's not about drugs personally, because if it were about drugs, somebody else would be giving this talk right now. And I can tell you this because the statute of limitations has expired. If the war on drugs were about drugs, then surely I would have known it. Because, you know, I spent about 15 months working as a community organizer in the city of New Orleans in the mid-90s. And during the 15 months that I was doing that in public housing in the city of New Orleans, I saw fewer drugs in 15 months in public housing in New Orleans than I saw a typical weekend night on the 8th floor of Monroe Hall, Tulane University, between the fall of 1986 and the end of the spring semester of 1987. And in case you are not following me closely enough, that would have been my floor. In fact, I saw fewer drugs in 15 months in public housing than I saw on a typical Saturday night in room 804, which I think was my room. I can't be clear on it, but I know But Obama couldn't talk about that. He also couldn't mention the study the LAPD, on the LAPD rates of stoppage and search that came out like 4 or 5 months ago. Found the same as the Department of Justice study, only on a local level, that the LAPD is 2 to 3 times more likely to stop and search Black and Latino men for illegal contraband of one kind or another, even though the white guys, when searched, are more likely to actually be found with the stuff on us, whether it's drugs, whether it's guns, or whatever else.